In the Texas courtroom deciding a billion-dollar inheritance oil tycoon, Beau Beaumont stood and declared Wyatt was not his biological son, stripping him of all rights before hundreds of stunned eyes. But Wyatt merely smiled, pulling out a secret envelope from his late mother, and in that moment the entire Beaumont empire began crumbling beneath the feet of the true betrayers. The air inside the Tarrant County Courthouse did not just feel heavy, it felt thick with the scent of old wood floor wax and the impending death of a legacy. I sat on the polished oak bench, my spine pressed against the hard backrest, feeling the vibration of 250 people whispering behind me. It was a low rhythmic hum, like the sound of vultures circling a wounded animal. In the heart of Texas, a courtroom is not just a place for law, it is a stage for public execution. And today the man holding the axe was my own father. Across the aisle, Beau sat like a king on a temporary throne. His Stetson lay on the table in front of him, white and pristine, a stark contrast to the darkness in his eyes. He did not look at me. He had not looked at me for months. Beside him, Amber leaned in her blonde hair, perfectly coiffed, whispering something into his ear that made him nod. She was 20 years younger than him, a sharp-edged woman who moved into our ranch before my mother's scent had even faded from the hallways. I caught the light reflecting off her hand and my stomach turned. There it was, the emerald ring. It was a deep forest green stone that had belonged to my mother Loretta. She had promised it to me on her deathbed, telling me to give it to the woman I would one day love. Now it sat on Amber's finger, a trophy of her conquest. It was the ultimate insult, a silent declaration that everything my mother built was being systematically erased. The judge cleared his throat, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. Before the clerk could even call the case to order, Beau stood up. He did not wait for his lawyer. He did not follow protocol. In this county, Beau Beaumont was the protocol. Your Honor, Beau began, his voice a gravelly roar that commanded the attention of every soul in the room. I would like to save this court some time. We are here to discuss the distribution of the Beaumont estate, but there is a fundamental error in the filings. That young man sitting over there, Wyatt, is not my biological son. The room inhaled collectively. It was a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the humidity. I felt the heat rise to my neck, but I did not flinch. I had practiced this moment in my head 1,000 times, yet the sheer cruelty of his delivery still stung like a whip. He is a fraud. Beau continued, turning his head just enough to cast a look of pure disgust in my direction. He has lived under my roof, eaten my bread, and used my name for 28 years, but he carries none of my blood. He is the product of his mother's indiscretion, a lie that Loretta kept hidden until the day she died. As of this moment, I am stripping him of the Beaumont name. He is no heir of mine. He is nothing more than a mistake I am finally correcting. Amber's lips curled into a tiny, triumphant smile. She adjusted the emerald ring, making sure the light hit it just right. The whispers behind me turned into a roar. I saw the local press photographers angling their lenses, hungry for the image of the fallen prince. For 28 years, I had been the CEO's intern. I fixed the fences when the storms tore them down. I stayed up until 4 o'clock in the morning during calving season while Beau slept in his air-conditioned suite. I managed the oil leases that kept the private jets fueled. I was the backbone of the ranch, yet I was treated like a contracted laborer who was never quite trusted enough to be part of the inner circle. I had been a ghost in my own home, waiting for a sign of affection that never came. "Is that all, Beau?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but in the sudden silence of the room it carried to the very last row. Beau narrowed his eyes. "It is enough to ruin you, boy." I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the vanity, the aging pride, and the toxic influence of the woman sitting beside him. He thought he was taking everything from me. He thought he was erasing my worth by denying our biology. He did not realize that by cutting the ties of blood, he had also cut the chains of my loyalty. "You want to talk about bloodlines?" I stood up slowly, my movements deliberate and calm. "You want to talk about who truly belongs in this family and who is an intruder, I reached down and picked up my leather briefcase, the handle worn smooth by years of work. My fingers found the latch and clicked it open. The sound seemed to snap through the room like a gunshot. From the inner pocket, I pulled out a thick white envelope. The edges were slightly yellowed, and the seal had been reinforced with tape years ago. I had kept this envelope hidden for 15 years. I had moved it from floorboard to floorboard, from safe to safe, waiting for the day when the lies would become too heavy for the house to hold. 15 years ago, my mother gave me this, I said, holding the envelope up so the entire room could see it. She told me that the truth would either set me free or burn the house down. Today, Bo, I think we are all going to watch it burn. I broke the seal. The silence that followed the tearing of the envelope was heavy, but my mind was already miles away, retreating into the dusty corridors of the past. To understand why I was standing there, one had to understand the woman who raised me. Loretta was a woman of quiet strength and loud faith. She did not yell, she simply endured. But even the strongest foundations eventually show cracks when the earth begins to shift. After the funeral, when the house felt like an empty cathedral, and Bo was already seen taking business meetings with a young woman named Amber, I found myself in my mother's private sanctuary. It was a small room, overlooking the north pasture filled with the scent of dried lavender and old leather. On her nightstand lay the family Bible, a massive gold-embossed book that had recorded every birth, marriage, and death in the Beaumont line for 3 generations. I sat on her bed and opened the heavy cover. I expected to find comfort. Instead, I found a roadmap of betrayal. Tucked between the Book of Psalms and the Book of Proverbs were not just pressed flowers, but loose scraps of paper margins torn from newspapers and the backs of grocery receipts. They were covered in my mother's elegant, slanted handwriting. "He thinks I do not see," one note read. "He thinks the shadows in the barn belong to the horses, but horses do not whisper names." Another note, dated just months before her diagnosis, was more direct. "Chase is not here for the land. He is here for what is already taken. I see the way Amber looks at him when Bo turns his back. My heart breaks not for the money, but for the soul of this ranch." I stared at those words until they blurred. Chase was my father's most trusted advisor, the man who handled our real estate expansions. Amber was the woman who had ostensibly come to help my mother with her care. They were the vipers Loretta had allowed into her nest, and they were poisoning the air she breathed. I remembered the last conversation I had with her. She was frail, her hands like parchment, but her eyes were sharp with an ancient clarity. I had been crying, fueled by a young man's rage at how Bo was already ignoring her. She took my face in her hands and whispered words that became my internal compass. "Wyatt, listen to me." She had said, her voice a fragile thread of silver. "The truth is not a weapon to be swung in anger. It is not a sword meant to draw blood. The truth is a shield. Do not use it to attack your father, no matter how much he hurts you. Use it to protect what you love. Use it to protect the memory of this family when the lies start to burn." After she passed, the shuffling began. Bo married Amber within 6 months. Chase became a permanent fixture at our dinner table. I felt the walls closing in, so I did what any man born of the dirt and the oil would do. I watched. I knew the stables were the only place on the ranch that felt sacred to my mother. It was also the only place where the cellular signal was weak and the shadows were long. I spent 3 nights secretly installing high-definition motion-activated cameras hidden inside the antique iron lanterns hanging from the rafters. I did not want to see what I saw, but I had to know. The footage was undeniable. It was not just an affair, it was a partnership of predators. I watched Amber and Chase leaning against the hay bales, laughing about Bo's declining health and discussing how they would redevelop the north pasture, the very land where my mother's ashes had been scattered, into a luxury resort once they pushed me out. But I needed more than just a video of an affair. Texas law and my father's pride required something ironclad. I had to prove that the child Amber was carrying, the boy they named Colt, was not a Beaumont. For months I played the role of the dutiful, submissive son. I bowed my head when Bo insulted me. I ran the errands that Chase was too important to handle. I waited for one single moment of carelessness. It finally happened during a branding event. The heat was blistering and Chase was sweating profusely. He took off his custom Stetson, the one with the silver band he bragged about, and left it on the fence post while he went to the wash station. I did not hesitate. I reached inside the sweatband and pulled away 3 long dark strands of hair roots intact. I placed them into a sterile vial I had been carrying in my pocket for weeks. I already had my own sample. I already had a sample from Bo's shaving kit. I stood in that courtroom looking at the envelope in my hand, remembering the weight of that Stetson and the cold clarity of my mother's voice. I was not there to be a son. I was there to be the shield. I looked at the judge, then at the man who had just called me a mistake. "You said I do not carry your blood, Bo," I said, my voice steady, and for the first time in my life I thank God for that. Because if I had your blood, I might have been as blind as you. I pulled the first document from the envelope. It was not my DNA test. It was the report for the boy sitting in the front row. "Let us talk about Colt," I said, "and let us talk about who his father really is." I walked to the center of the courtroom floor, the floorboards groaning under my boots. I handed the first document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. The silence in the room was so absolute that the sound of the judge turning the page felt like a crack of thunder. "This is a certified paternity report," I said, my voice projecting to the back of the gallery. "The DNA profile for the child Colt Beaumont was compared against the profile of Chase Miller. The results are conclusive. There is a 99.9% probability that Chase is the biological father." The reaction was instantaneous. Bo froze his face, turning an ashen shade of gray that made his white hair look like a shroud. Amber gasped, her hand flying to her throat, covering the emerald ring. Chase stood up instinctively, his chair screeching against the floor, but he found nowhere to go. The 250 people in the room erupted into a fever of whispers and shocked exclamations. "Silence!" the judge barked, banging his gavel. "He is lying!" Amber screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "That is a forgery. He is trying to steal what belongs to my son." "I am not trying to steal anything, Amber," I replied, looking her directly in the eyes. "Because, as of today, I am the only person in this room who does not need a single cent from the Beaumont estate." This was the moment the ground shifted beneath them. I reached back into the envelope and pulled out a yellowed handwritten document. "Your Honor, I would like to introduce a secondary document. It is a holographic will and a deed of trust signed by my mother, Loretta Beaumont, 20 years ago. It has been verified and witnessed by our neighbor, Dottie West, who is present in this room today." Oh, Dottie, a woman with silver hair and eyes as sharp as a hawk, stood up from the third row and nodded solemnly. I turned back to Bo, who looked as though he had been struck by a physical blow. "You stood up today and told everyone that I was a mistake. You thought that by revealing I was not your biological son, you could leave me with nothing. But here is the truth you never bothered to learn about the woman you married." I began to read from my mother's letter, the words flowing like a river of fire. "Loretta knew I was not your biological son from the day I was born, Bo. There was a medical complication during my birth, a blood type incompatibility that made the truth undeniable to her. She never told you not to deceive you, but because she saw how much you needed an heir to fuel your pride. She chose to love me. She chose to make me a Beaumont." The room was breathless. I continued, "But she also knew who you were. She knew that your love was conditional and that one day your vanity would lead you to someone like Amber. 20 years ago, using the inheritance from her own family, the mineral rights to the Blackwood acreage that you always thought were dried up, she established a private trust in my name." I dropped the document onto the table. "Those dry wells have been producing 5,000 barrels a day for the last decade, managed quietly by a firm in Houston under my mother's maiden name. I have more wealth in that single trust than this entire ranch has generated in the last 5 years. I did not stay here for your money, Bo. I did not stay here because I needed a name on a piece of paper. I stepped closer to him, my voice dropping to a low, intense rumble. I stayed because I knew Chase and Amber were waiting for you to get old enough and weak enough to be destroyed. I stayed to protect the man who raised me, even if he was too proud to see the vipers in his own bed. I stayed to honor the woman who gave me everything while you were busy giving her ring to a stranger. Bo looked down at his hands, which were now shaking uncontrollably. The powerful patriarch of Fort Worth had vanished, replaced by a man who realized he had just traded his only loyal defender for a betrayal he had helped fund. "You did not cast me out, Bo," I said. "I have been standing outside your walls for a long time watching you set your own house on fire. And now I think it is time for everyone to see exactly how the match was lit." I reached for the final item in the envelope, a small black flash drive. "But we are not done, because there is a reason you have been feeling so tired lately, Bo. There is a reason your memory has been failing you, and it has nothing to do with old age." I stepped toward the evidence table and plugged the black flash drive into the court's laptop. The large monitors mounted on the wood-paneled walls flickered to life. Chase attempted to move toward the exit, his face a mask of panicked sweat, but 2 county deputies moved silently to block the heavy oak doors. They had been briefed an hour before the hearing began. "What you are about to see is not just about a broken marriage," I said, my voice echoing through the hollow silence of the room. "It is about a slow, methodical attempt to erase a man while he was still breathing." The video footage was grainy but clear. It was time-stamped from 3 weeks ago inside the ranch's kitchen at 2 o'clock in the morning. Amber was standing by the counter illuminated by the hum of the refrigerator light. She was not alone. Chase stood behind her, his hands on her waist, whispering into her ear. On the counter sat Bo's weekly pill organizer. The gallery gasped as the camera zoomed in. Amber reached into her pocket and pulled out a small brown vial. With practiced precision, she began removing Bo's white blood pressure capsules and replacing them with a yellow liquid gel cap. "My father has been struggling with what his doctors called early-onset cognitive decline," I explained, looking directly at the judge. "He became confused. He forgot his appointments. He signed documents. He did not read documents that gave Chase Miller power of attorney over the Beaumont oil leases. But he was not sick. He was being drugged with high doses of a scopolamine derivative, a substance designed to induce confusion and docility." The footage jumped forward. It showed Chase laughing as he watched Bo stumble in the hallway later that morning, mocking the man who had given him his career. Bo slumped in his chair, a broken giant. He looked at the screen, then at Amber, his eyes filling with a devastating, lucid horror. He realized in that moment that every affectionate evening and every caring reminder to take his medicine was a step toward his own funeral. You were killing me," Bo whispered, his voice cracking like dry earth. Amber turned her eyes, darting around the room like a trapped animal. "It is not what it looks like. Wyatt manipulated the footage. He is a liar." But her protests were cut short. A detective from the Major Crimes Division stepped forward from the back of the room, an arrest warrant in his hand. "Amber Beaumont and Chase Miller," the detective announced, his voice booming. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, elder abuse, and grand larceny." The deputies moved in the metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut, sounding like a final judgment. As they led Amber past the witness stand, she struggled, her face contorted in a scream of foul language that stripped away the last of her sophisticated facade. I stepped into her path, stopping her for a single heartbeat. I did not use force. I simply reached out and took her hand. My fingers brushed the emerald ring, the one she had worn as a symbol of her stolen status. With a swift, firm motion, I slid the ring off her finger. "This never belonged to you," I said, my voice cold and final. "It belongs to a woman of honor. You are just a guest who overstayed her welcome." Amber was dragged away, the flashing bulbs of the press photographers catching the tears of rage streaming down her face. Chase followed, his head bowed in a coward's silence. The courtroom began to clear, the spectators whispering in hushed, reverent tones about the fall of the Beaumont Empire. I stood alone in the center of the room until I felt a hand on my shoulder. I turned to find Bo standing behind me. He looked older than he had an hour ago, but for the first time in years the fog in his eyes had cleared. He reached out as if to touch my arm, then hesitated, his hand trembling in the air between us. "Wyatt," he choked out the name, sounding heavy in his mouth. "You knew. You knew all of it, and I stood up there and spat on your mother's memory. I tried to throw you away like trash." "I did not do this for your gratitude, Bo," I replied, looking down at the emerald ring resting in my palm. "Why?" he asked, his voice a mere shadow. "Why save a man who gave you nothing but a hard time and a cold house?" I looked at him, and for a moment I saw the man who had taught me how to ride the man who had once been my mother's whole world. "Because Loretta Beaumont raised me to be a man of my word," I said. "And I promised her I would look after the ranch. That includes you." Bo sank back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He was a man who owned thousands of acres, yet in that moment he was the most homeless person I had ever seen. He had his life back, but he had lost the only thing that made it worth living, the trust of the son he had refused to claim. The dust eventually settled on the Tarrant County Courthouse, and the headlines that had screamed of betrayal and oil-rich scandals began to fade. In the weeks that followed, the Beaumont Ranch became a quiet place, a tomb for a legacy that had been built on pride and held together by lies. Bo tried to make amends. He sent his lawyers with documents to sign the ranch over to me, offering me the chairmanship of the oil company and the keys to the kingdom I had spent 28 years maintaining. He called my phone every night at sunset, his voice sounding smaller and more fragile with every message he left. He was a man drowning in the realization that his biological obsession had nearly cost him his life, and that the intern he had dismissed was the only true Beaumont left standing. I declined it all. I did not want the oil leases, the limestone mansion, or the weight of a name that had been dragged through the mud. I realized that my mother, Loretta, had not left me that trust fund so I could buy my way back into a broken house. She had left it so I could build a new one. I packed my belongings into my old truck, the one I had paid for with my own wages, and drove east. I did not stop until I reached the rolling green hills of Nashville, Tennessee. There, far from the smell of crude oil and the sharp shadows of the Fort Worth skyline, I purchased a sprawling piece of land with a white farmhouse and a barn that smelled of fresh hay and cedar. I called it Loretta's home. It was not a business venture, it was a mission. I used the mineral rights my mother had secured for me to create a sanctuary for children who, like me, had been told they did not belong. I opened the doors to foster kids who had aged out of the system and orphans who had been cast aside by families that valued bloodlines over hearts. One afternoon, a letter arrived from Texas. It was written in Bo's shaky, uneven hand. He told me he was selling the ranch and moving to a small house in the hill country. He asked if he could visit just once to see the man I had become. I sat on my porch for a long time watching the fireflies dance over the creek. I did not write a long letter in return. I did not vent my anger or demand an apology. Instead, I found an old, faded photograph in the back of my wallet. It was a picture of a 5-year-old boy sitting on a fence and a much younger, stronger Bo standing beside him, pointing toward the horizon. I mailed the photo back to him with a single sentence written on the back. I have forgiven the man in this picture, but that horizon is behind me now. Living here in Nashville has taught me something that the ranch never could. Your value is not a birthright. It is not something that can be granted to you by a powerful father or taken away by a cruel mother-in-law. True worth is built in the quiet moments when you choose to do the right thing, even when no one is watching and even when it costs you everything. I stopped seeking the approval of a man who could not see me, and in doing so, I finally found myself. I learned that family is not a matter of shared DNA. It is a matter of shared sacrifice. It is the people who stay when the storms hit, not the ones who look for an exit strategy. Today, the sun is dipping low over the Tennessee hills, casting long golden shadows across the grass. A group of children are gathered around me on the porch. Some have scars you can see, others carry scars hidden deep inside. I open a worn copy of a book my mother used to love, And as I begin to read, I see their faces light up with the same hope I once felt in her kitchen. I am no longer the ghost in someone else's mansion. I am the architect of my own peace. If you have ever been silenced by your own family, or if you have ever been told that you are not enough because of where you came from, I want you to remember this. You are the author of your own final chapter. Do not let their lies become your truth. Listen to the quiet voice in your heart that knows your worth, and never let anyone else define your legacy. The truth might burn the house down, but it is only so you can build something beautiful in the clearing. My name is Wyatt, and for the first time in my life, I am exactly where I am supposed to be.